Going to look now at Jude 9. Michael the Archangel, when contending with the devil, he disputed about the body of Moses, and he dared not bring against him a railing accusation, but said, "The Lord rebuke you." Now, I've shown that in my book, The Real Devil, you can get a free copy of this. If you go to realdevil.info, you get a free PDF or a free hard copy. I've explained there that the word Satan or devil simply means an adversary or a false accuser. And it's used about men. For example, Jesus says to Peter, "Get behind me, Satan." That's in Matthew 16:21 to 23. He says that he chose 12, and yet one of you, John 6, verse 70 and 71, one of you is a devil, is a false accuser, is a slanderer. And it says he spoke about Judas. So when we encounter these words, Satan or devil, we're not necessarily talking about a dragon with horns and all this kind of stuff, or a cosmic being. These words are frequently used simply about human beings. And so here we have a reference to Michael, an angel, having a contention with, quote, the devil or Satan. Now, sometimes Satan, or the devil, can be used about a system of things. For example, in Revelation chapter 2, you read about some of the early believers living where Satan's throne was. That doesn't mean that in Pergamos, that's the group that was being written to, there was a throne with, a guy with a pitchfork and a long tail sitting on it. What it means is that was the centre of administration of the Roman Empire in that area. And so the Satan, in that context, was the great adversary to God's people at that time, which was the Roman Empire. So Satan, or the devil, can refer to a group of people or a system. And that is, I think, the case here, because Jude is in parallel with 2 Peter chapter 2. And if you go back to 2 Peter chapter 2, verse 11, the equivalent there says this: "Angels, which are greater in power and might, bring not railing accusation against them before the Lord." So the devil here represents them, a group of people. Well, I'd like to remind you that Jude here is writing to people who have accepted Christianity, been baptized, but they're being led away by false teachers. And he reminds them in verse 5 that having saved the people out of the land of Egypt, the Lord afterward destroyed them that believe not. And he wants to remind them, he says, "I will put you therefore in remembrance of what God did in the history of Israel." And that is made clear again in 2 Peter chapter 2. So what we're reading here is Jude's commentary upon incidents in the recorded history of Israel that his readers knew. So he's not talking about anything that is outside the pages of the Bible. By the way, if you still want to take this in the way that a lot of people do, it says that Michael the Archangel, when contending with the devil, he rebuked or forbade the devil. And yet sin and evil, wickedness, etc. is growing. So it would appear then that if you want to take this literally as the devil, as in the guy with horns that people believe in, well, this Michael the Archangel wasn't very powerful at all. He rebuked him, he forbade him, but a guy continued doing what he's doing. So I don't think that quite follows. But I think actually the whole reference to the devil is fairly incidental to the thrust of Jude's argument, and that's why when Peter uses this, he doesn't even use the word devil. He talks about Michael the Archangel's attitude to, quote, them, a group of people. Because his point is that they themselves, that even angels themselves, do not judge people. He says that they say, "The Lord rebuke you." That's the point, what he's saying. Whereas, he says, verse 8, "These false teachers you've got amongst you, they're arrogant and they speak evil of celestial beings, they despise dominion, etc. But angels, who are far greater than them, actually talk with some restraint and only talk in terms of God doing the final judgment of people." But, verse 10 of Jude, "But these false teachers speak evil of what they totally don't know, whereas angels who are far greater than them have far more restraint and culture in the way in which they speak. Now, without question, Jude is referring here to an incident in Zechariah chapter 3, and I suggest that you might like to look back at Zechariah chapter 3, and we'll read verses 1 and 2, and this is symbolic, it's a vision that we're reading. He showed me Joshua the high priest standing before the angel of the Lord, and Satan, the adversary, standing at his right hand to resist him. And the Lord said to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you, O Satan, even the Lord that has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you. Is not this, that is Jerusalem, a brand plucked out of the fire?" Now here in Jude, we read in verse 23 of Jude about some saved with fear pulling them out of the fire. So that's clearly connected there. But of course, in Zechariah 3, the angel of the Lord says to Satan, "The Lord rebuke you." And here in Jude, Michael the Archangel just defines which angel was in view, says to the devil, Satan and the devil are parallel, "The Lord rebuke you." Now what's going on here? The context in Zechariah 3 was that the Jews had returned to Jerusalem from Babylon, and they're trying to rebuild the temple. But, Ezra 4 verse 4, the people of the land troubled them in building, and in verse 1 of Ezra 4, they are called the adversaries of Judah. And although it's not actually the Hebrew word shatan, the idea is the same, that Judah, the Jews in rebuilding the temple, had adversaries. They had Satans. And here in Zechariah 3, that whole situation is being expressed in a visionary, symbolic kind of way. Now, in Ezra 4 verse 6, we read that these adversaries, they wrote an accusation, a false accusation against the Jews. And they wrote this to the king of Persia. And what I think Zechariah 3 is doing is saying, look, all that stuff that's going on here on earth, do you know what? It's got its reflection in the court of heaven, and God sees what's going on. And the argument then was about Joshua the high priest, because in Zechariah 3, we go on to read in verse 3, that Joshua the high priest was clothed with filthy garments, and he doesn't have the high priestly mitre on his head, because it's put on his head in verse 5. So I think the argument was that this new Jewish high priest called Joshua is not really a valid high priest because he hasn't got the proper clothes, the high priestly clothes. Maybe they got lost in captivity during the exile. But then the angel tells the adversary, the group of opponents, "The Lord rebuke you," and he proceeds to clothe Joshua the high priest with a set of priestly clothes and the priestly mitre. That's in Zechariah 3, 4 and 5. Just showing that, no, God has chosen Jerusalem. And he says that. "The Lord that has chosen Jerusalem rebuke you." Jerusalem is a brand plucked out of the fire. We read that very phrase at the end of Jude about saving those who have repented by plucking them out of the fire of condemnation. And I think he's saying, look, Jude has repented. They are a brand that's been plucked out of the fire of condemnation. I have accepted them. And so I rebuke you. But as I say, the point is that even Michael the Archangel said, "The Lord, I rebuke you on behalf of the Lord rebuke you." That's the whole point. The reference to the devil is sort of incidental. This group of people who were adversaries and falsely accusing the Jews at that time. And I suggest that it's Joshua the high priest who is called here in Jude the body of Moses. And I suggest that that was a Jewish term that was understood within rabbinical Judaism to refer to the high priest. And in fact, body is often used in the Bible as a kind of figure of speech for a slave. The slave of Moses was the high priest. So then, you know how it is when sometimes you're talking to someone and all that they're saying to you is true on one level, but you perceive that there is a subtext. They're getting at something else as well as what they're talking to you about in so many words. And that is what's going on here. Because all through Jude and the parallel in 2 Peter 2, it's full of allusions to a book, an apostate Jewish book called the Book of Enoch. And if you get hold of my book, The Real Devil, I've gone through the Book of Enoch and the letter of Jude and 2 Peter 2 in 2 columns, and I've put all the similarities between them. There's absolutely no question that Jude and 2 Peter 2, they've got their eye on this apostate Book of Enoch. Not because they agree with it, but they're alluding to it to deconstruct it, to say, yes, that's what this book says, but actually that's not true. Book of Enoch had the idea that Michael the Archangel got hold of 200 sinful angels up in heaven. He rebuked them, and he found that they were sinners, and he chucked them out. And they came down to earth and married these pretty girls, and so on and so forth, and run around making evil and responsible for all our sin. This is nonsense. That's about as, frankly, as stupid as saying that, that there's a psychopath who's convicted for multiple murders, and he's thrown out of the courtroom by the judge, and the judge, puts a gun in his hand and sends him off to a, primary school playground. That's about as, as dumb as that. And, in that sense, that would mean that we are basically innocent. We human beings are just the victim of some cosmic game that took place when Michael chucked out these 200 angels. Whereas the Bible consistently says that the real battle is not between you and some cosmic beings up there that you have no power over, but it is a battle for the mind within your heart. That sin and evil ultimately originate out of the mind of human beings. So then Peter picks that up when he says that angels do not bring slanderous accusations against other angels. That's 2 Peter 2 verse 11. And here I think what Jude is saying by mentioning Michael the Archangel is saying, look, what's written in the book of Enoch about Michael the Archangel, that's nonsense. You want to know what Michael the Archangel actually did? He was actually involved in that vision in rebuking the adversaries of Judah, who were ordinary, normal human beings on earth. And you know what? Even when he did that, he said, "The Lord rebuke you." He didn't act like the book of Enoch says and sort of cuss all these angels and bring all sorts of stuff on them and then chuck them out from heaven all the way down to earth. So he's deconstructing that. But the context of all of this that we're reading here in Jude is that God sees. And history repeats itself, that all these instances from the history of Israel speak to us, that God finally will do what is right on the earth, and he will justify those who are on his side, and without question, judgment will come upon those individuals, those human beings. Forget about cosmic beings, 200 angels chucked out of heaven and all that stuff. Judgment will come upon those individuals who persecute his people.